All right, we are recording. It is November 21st, at least in California, and we've got a few things to get through today.
I think we need to.
Shane added something to the agenda, but I know he's not here today, and I'm actually not sure what he means by a pair programming or tooling meeting. So I don't know if anyone else has any context. Otherwise, we may just move on.
Yeah, we should also do the usual. This is Kubernetes meeting. Need to abide by the code of conduct, please. In short, please be nice to each other. For the record.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, please be
Um,
nice.
yeah. I think that we need to wait for Shane to come back. We might just need to carry that one forward for a couple of weeks and talk to Shane about that when he comes back. That means that we are on to let's talk VO60.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I'm just going to run through a whole bunch of things here. The short story here, if you want just a high level summary, is that the version of the API we have right now is near identical to what we will release as VO60. That is, I feel pretty confident in saying that. With that out of the way, we still have some formalities to work through and a whole bunch of work to actually get the release out. So let's talk about everything involved there. First up, I have a changelog PR. This is very much work in progress, but it helps at least highlight the differences that I'm aware of. This needs to be cleaned up, grouped, and made something that is easier to understand and for anyone that might not have been as involved with these changes. But this is basically just the results of running one of our scripts to generate release notes and grouping things together. If there's anything that you're aware of that is not included in this changelog, please let us know. But this at this point is primarily just existing to ensure that we have the full scope of things covered in our changelog. It will be cleaned up soon enough. The other thing, on Friday, we started the Gateway API V060 review. For anyone who's not really familiar with our process and how things work, we as Gateway API maintainers try to get the API to a point that we believe is ready for release, and then we send it off to SIG network API reviewers. In this case, it's Tim and Cal who are going through the API and running through everything with their API reviewer perspective, that are a little more disconnected to try and see if we missed anything, if there are any nits, whatever. On Friday, we started that off just with a quick meeting that kind of highlighted all the changes that we were aware of going into this release, gave some time to just talk through at a high level what those look like and any kind of high level feedback, and then just asked Cal and Tim to actually run through the PR that has the full diff and go into an in-depth review. So I just, for the sake of completeness, I created a few slides just that this is just what we went through on Friday. There's nothing particularly notable in here, but just it may be an interesting way to see what is actually changing in this release. Few notes in here, but anyway, that's what we presented and walked through, and then have some meeting notes here as well for general back and forth discussion, whatever, on whoever could make it. Just I don't think there's anything actionable in here. It's just maybe helpful to understand the scope of the meeting and just any top level feedback we got just as we started the meeting, the review off. But there's much more feedback in the actual API review PR. And that is this one, 1538. We already have 48 comments. I expect that number will only increase as time goes on. We can use, I'll speak for myself and say we can use a lot of help actually responding to these comments. So especially if you see some of these that just seem like, oh, I could fix that. There are some of these that are fairly straightforward. It's not clearly worded. Well, that's great. If you can make a PR, make this better, just please comment and say, hey, I can work on this. That would be amazing. There's a lot of things in here that could
a lot of
could
very
be
small
fixed.
sort of net style pickups that we need to fix, but like they're not complicated or hard fixes that require a lot of familiarity with everything that's going on.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
a lot of them are good first issues, essentially.
yeah. Just think of this PR as a whole host of tiny, good first issues. You can combine them however you want, but if you want to work on these, please like add a comment on the thing saying, hey, I'm going to take this and we'll leave it for you.
Because otherwise, in the interest of getting this done, probably next week, I'm going to just pick up all of the little changes and do them. But if you want to do it, like it's cool, but like we are on a bit of a clock. So, if you want to do it, that's fine, but put your name down soon and grab it. Otherwise, probably next week sometime when we don't have the meetings and there's less going on and less people are around, I will get cracking on PRs to fix these if no one else has done it already.
Yeah, big plus one. I mean, I think with all these things, we are just trying to do everything we can to get a release out. We are so close at this point. We just want to get this release out. I'd agree with what you're saying. Like none of these are huge breaking changes. These are just bits of cleanup that I think will be helpful. With that said, there are a few things that require a bit more help and thought. One of the things that we at least need to document, certainly in the release notes, but probably more broadly, is what we plan to do with reference grant. I think that everyone's okay with reference grant going to beta, but want a plan for what does it look like when reference grant goes upstream, which seems like the most likely path for it after this. So once it becomes a core Kubernetes upstream API, what do we do with it inside of Gateway API? I think at a high level, that's going to be that we keep track of the CRD as long as our version support window it requires, right? So we said we support 5 trailing Kubernetes versions, which means we're going to hold on to this reference grant CRD for a while, but at some point it's going to drop off. So when we graduate this to beta, we need to clearly document that at some point it is going to be removed from our API in favor of what's upstream.
So the big advantage there is that when it goes upstream, that the implementers who are in this meeting won't need to implement the behavior because the API server will implement the behavior. Is that the idea, or is it going to be?
I wish we could make it quite that generic. I don't know that we can even do that. I think I think unfortunately, maybe that's
the dream, right? Like,
yeah, I was talking with someone at KubeCon about like, could we do a custom authorizer? There's a maybe, but in any case, when it goes upstream, it will be something that eventually leaves Gateway API, the project, and moves on. Maybe implemented centrally. I don't know, but that would be very cool.
Yes, I mean, that's the dream, right? Like that we make it so the reference grant is part of the core APIs and that you don't need to worry about in the same way as RBAC is, and you don't need to worry about, you just basically say, if the reference grant isn't there, then the API server is like, no, you can't make that reference or something like that. But it is complicated to implement. So it could be that the RBAC is there and you need to check it as an implementer still. But yeah, in any case, the more that we can make this upstream, the better off it'll be.
Yeah. Can I ask a quick question regarding reference grant?
Sure.
Is it the ability to just reference any Kubernetes object and resource into your?
So yeah, that's the idea, is that it's a pretty generic spec that you can. It has like a, you put it in the same namespace as the thing that it's granting reference access to. And it has kind and a kind selector only at the moment. And then it has the from selector has a kind and a namespace selector. So basically you say, I want to allow references to this secret from gateways in the secure namespace or something like that. But yeah, you could conceivably also use it for, I want to allow access to this secret from, from ingress objects in this other namespace or something like that too. Conceivably, that is not part of the current spec, but like it's designed to be generic like that. But it's designed for cross namespace references.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not like it was.
Sorry, you go.
Sorry, go.
No, you go.
Sorry. So I was thinking like you can possibly reference like CRDs, like.
Yes, totally.
Okay.
Yeah. So the idea here is that so when you're making a cross namespace reference, unless both ends of the cross namespace reference agree, then it's not safe. So if I have a gateway in one namespace and it wants to refer to a secret in another namespace, unless the secret is sort of says I allow access to that gateway, then it's not a safe reference because the person who owns the secret needs to say I'm okay with this. And so this is like a formalized contract way of you doing that. And so the intent is that yes, absolutely, you can use it for granting reference access to a CRD from some other CRD, totally. In the Gateway API though, we've actually not done that for some things because between gateway and HTTP route, you can do those across namespaces. But because we have control of the spec, we've actually just put that stuff inside the spec. So for gateway and HTTP route, the HTTP route says, I want to attach to this gateway. And the gateway has a thing called allowed routes inside it that says, I will only accept routes that look like this. And so that's the same two-way handshake. So you don't need a reference grant in that case. And so reference grant is kind of intended to be used for where you don't have control over one side of the spec, or both sides. And so if you have control over one side of the both sides of the spec, I would recommend doing something more like what we've done with HTTP route and gateway, where one refers to the other and the other one makes a lock basically, or a hole that sort of validates what ones can be referred to. And it's completely valid to have that be like anything is fine, but like the default should be more secure than anything is fine. You should have to take some positive action to say I will allow connections from anything in any namespace. Like you should need to do that because that's a big deal, and you shouldn't do it without thinking about it. Does that make sense?
I think at first I was just thinking within the same namespace, like referencing a resource, like another resource, like a custom resource definition within the same namespace. But I think when you're talking about cross namespace, I haven't thought about that. So are you saying that reference grants can allow a cross namespace, but are you supposed to have like a reference grant on the other side of the namespace that says it's okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
So within the same namespace, we have generally assumed that within the same namespace, like the namespace is kind of the smallest unit of trust you have in Kubernetes, right? Like you can't really segment things inside a namespace. And so there's no point having a reference grant inside a namespace because more than likely the person who controls the namespace controls everything in the namespace. So there's no reference grant is not really needed because like it's assumed that the same owner controls everything. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yep. And then but between namespaces, there's no way to know for sure which owner controls each namespace. And so you need to have like the thing that it originates the cross namespace request needs to agree with the thing that is receiving the cross namespace request. And that needs to sort of say, yes, I'm okay with this connection. Do you get that? So that's what
you have you have two reference grants on each
no. So
no.
So the intent here is, so if you look at the diagram that Rob's got up on the screen, the HTTP route can refer to a backend, right, in another namespace. But so the HTTP route doesn't need a reference grant to do that because the reference is outbound. You're right. The HTTP route is saying, I want to use this backend, and it happens to be in another namespace, right? So the HTTP route is kind of making a request to be able to use the service in another namespace. What the reference grant does is allow the owner of that service to say that request is okay. Yes, I agree to this. And so you only need it like where the where the reference points to, right? So that's why it's called reference grant, is you grant access to that thing that's in the same namespace to have references point to it.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's fine. Like, yeah, like I completely get it. This is very confusing and hard to understand. Part of what I want to do is I had a talk accepted to KubeCon NA that I unfortunately couldn't do because I wasn't there, but which was like explaining reference grant, why we built it this way. That literally the reason I could tell you all this off the top of my head is that I still wrote the talk. So I actually have a talk with slides and stuff that I'm hoping to give at KubeCon EU about this, about literally this. But probably before, in the absence of that, it probably would make sense for us to do a blog about it, maybe Rob or something like that, that summarizes the talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to clear up this sort of thing, because it can be very hard to understand when you haven't seen it before.
Yeah, and cross namespace references are not really a thing that has existed in Kubernetes before. We're kind of
Because of this problem.
Yeah. So this is intended to be a generic way to solve it. And the reason we're talking about upstreaming it and moving it into core Kubernetes is that SIG storage also has a very similar problem, and they also want to use reference grant, and it doesn't make sense for them to use a resource that is in gateway.networking.k8io, API.
For storage stuff. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. And feel free to hit me up with more questions about this on Slack or something if you have them, if you think of them later. This is kind of like probably slightly more my baby than Rob's. Yeah, Rob's done a lot of great work on it, but like, I think that, like this is probably slightly more my thing. So like I'm always happy to explain this to people.
Yeah, likewise. Nick and I are in different time zones, so if Nick is offline, I'm probably online, or vice versa. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to either one. But agree that Nick has done a lot of awesome work with reference grant.
I should probably just take this moment to publicly say that a lot of this work on reference grant is actually based on stuff that Joe Beda and Dave Cheney did in Contour with the TLS certificate delegation. I need to give credit where credit is due. And I'm standing on the shoulders of giants on this one.
Cool. So I'll keep on running through here. So we were just covering the reference grant to upstream, but the next one I wanted to cover was a bigger question about if reference grant really needs spec. Well, it it's a two-phase question of, does it need status? And if it doesn't need status, why do we have spec? So for anyone who's hasn't looked really deeply into reference grant, you may see that we have a spec, and then we have this commented out block saying status would go here if we did it, but we're not sure it needs it. And the broader, and generally in Kubernetes APIs, you follow a spec and status pattern where spec is the desired configuration, and status is basically a way for the underlying implementation to tell you what's happened. Reference grant is in this really weird gray area, and we're not sure what to do. So you could make the argument that it's really similar to RBAC in Kubernetes, where it's like a role resource and that does not have spec or status. You could make another argument that it's more like network policy, in which case it didn't start with spec and status, but we're working on adding status because it was deemed valuable. That's a bigger question, and that's kind of one of the things that came out of API review that if you have thoughts, I recommend adding them to the PR. I'm not sure. I don't think this is a blocker, but it would be good to make sure we have a very clear reason and rationale for why we have what we have in the API today before we go to beta. Because, I think the most significant part of V060 is that we're trying to graduate reference grant to beta. And then finally, we have a ton of util kind of pointer functions in our API right now. Cal asked, could we just use generics instead of recreating the same code a million times? I don't have a good, I think that makes sense. So one, I'm not sure.
Exactly the sort of, sorry, I was gonna say, it does seem like exactly the sort of use case that generics are designed for.
Yeah. I do want to make sure, I don't know how many implementers are on the call right now, but if you're working on an implementation of this API, do you find the various util pointer functions we have in the API useful? Like we don't need to include them. So I'm just trying to do it like a straw poll of if anybody is actually using them or if we just have code that is just sitting there but not useful.
I feel like if we don't get any answer now, that's cool. But what we might do is put a question in Slack, Rob, and lazy consensus it for like a few days, and say, oh, if we don't hear from everybody, we're going to replace these with generic
Yeah.
functions. Sanjay, you on video muted. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think we found them useful in Contour. I think Steve might have from Contour might have contributed a few of those helpers just because it's nice to have, but not a showstopper. But we just figured we were rewriting helper functions all over the place, so we figured other people probably could use them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Is that Contour's on Go 118 already, right? So there's no issue if we move to generics.
That's we're using generics in the small part of our code as well now, so
yeah,
we should be fine to move to that.
Okay, so the rough feedback is probably moving to generics is probably fine. Yeah, we
cool.
probably want to leave them in the API or something and add the generic ones in and warning or something. I don't know if we have a way to do warnings, but whatever.
Yeah, I mean, Kubernetes is historically something like we care very strongly about APIs as they are represented to users and backwards compatibility there, but there's not a strong policy for backwards compatibility when it comes to Go types, functions, anything like that. I don't know. I think in this case, I don't know if our util point, and I think this actually lines up with what was in chat as well, but I don't think that anything in our util pointers has actually been released yet. So we can probably just change
drop
whatever.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah. Okay, but with all that said, I want to move on to the 060 milestone quickly, but before I get there, I am not 100% sure that we'll get a release candidate out this week. I know that was kind of a goal of mine that I stated last week. Either way, I feel very confident if you are using this API and implementing this API, I would consider its current state right now as roughly release candidate worthy. We got the all clear to move forward in the direction of a release candidate. So even if we don't actually hit the RC button this week, assume that it's coming and assume that very minor changes are happening between now and formal release. Yeah. With that, any last comments or discussion on the 060 review process or anything like that? Cool. All right. I'm just going to keep on moving through these then. The 060 milestone is nearly done. Thank you. I think the very last one is SPR, and I think we have everyone on the call that is worth that could help discuss this. I had a question, and I think there was good back and forth, and maybe it's easier just to discuss on this call, since this really is the last thing on the agenda. I'm trying to, I think, Sanjay, you added a new condition here, and I was expecting a new reason. And I think you mentioned that the gap or the related something like suggested it should be a new condition instead of reason. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, from the bullets in the gap, they looked like they mentioned when you have incompatible filters, then you should add a new where is it? specifically
Yeah.
an error. It
I
might
think this is when it's the partial validity thing though, right?
yeah.
So that's what it is. So yeah, it's a HTTP with one rule that specifies a request and a redirect, like a redirect and the two incompatible filters. Then there's no config because there's no other rules, and so it's completely invalid. So that one you can just not accept it. But if there's more than one rule, then we're in the space where you need a like the rule that's in there that's valid should go into the data plane. So you've got some config, and so the invalid filters one rule will just get dropped. So we need some way to signal to people that your whole rule has been dropped because of invalid filters, because the filters are incompatible. And so the only way that we can do that is to have it like another condition, like a condition that does that. And I don't think we have a condition that covers like that. We don't have like a generic a rule in this is invalid because of some reason.
So I think what you're saying is that you want a new condition that covers a partially valid state for a route that says this is partially valid or partially invalid, whatever we want to say. And then at the same time, you want a new reason, and like the reason would be incompatible filters.
I think what we've been trying to do with the status is to make it so that we have the small number of top level like positive polarity conditions accepted, programmed, ready, and those ones are like, so those are true in the happy state, you know, that you want those to be true, and then it's okay to have extra conditions that are negative polarity that if they are present and true, then there's some error and they can go away when the error is no longer present. And so the idea here is that we have more specific error conditions that they're only present when there are specific problems. And so yeah, like I think we have a couple of those. We have resolved refs is not a good example here because that's actually positive polarity, I think. But like the idea is that there's sort of more specific error conditions that can come and go. And this one feels like it's a big enough deal that it warrants like a definitive like extra thing that's not just a message, a reason and a message on accepted, because you can't do it that way because partial validity. And so yeah, I'm not too worried about having a few extra conditions for specific problems in the same way that Node has conditions for like disk pressure, memory pressure, you know, like they're very sort of specific error things that you see. And so the Node object currently has like a Node ready or ready condition, and then if that's false, then a lot of the time it'll be false because one of the other error conditions is true. Like, you know, Docker's not running, there's memory pressure, there's disk pressure, there's something like that. And so that makes the node not be ready. And so the idea here is that these extra conditions sort of give you extra information about why things may not be ready and aren't always present. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'm a little concerned that we're going to end up with just a
Lots of
really
them.
long list of conditions. Another concern I'd have is that with incompatible filters specifically, that feels like a reason that could go unaccepted if it was the only, like if there was only one rule in the route.
So
then
maybe
you'd say accepted false and reason incompatible filters.
Maybe.
I don't know. That's where it feels a little funny to me, is that
incompatible filters feel like, you're right, incompatible filters feels at the level of something that could be a reason. Maybe, as you said, the correct approach here is that we have a condition that's like, rule invalid, like, or a rule error or something like that. And we say, incompatible filters, and then the message, and then we say, oh, for this condition, the message needs to tell you which rule it is, or something like that, so that then you know that, like, hey, at least one of your rules is not working for some reason, and you need to go and have a look at which one it is.
Do you remember the specifics of API, of conditions API? Like, can we have multiple entries for the same condition with different?
No, you cannot. It's a type. It's a list type map. So the type is the condition type is like a key, essentially. Yeah. So you can't have multiple conditions of the same type.
Realistically, we could probably also not focus on this for 06 because this is specifically around the incompatibility between URL rewrite and redirect. Like that's what the bullets in the GEP are talking about. But I mean, there could be other cases for implementations where other filters are incompatible or in some sense. Or like you said in the comments, like, what was it, like header rewrite and redirect?
If there's,
that even makes sense together? I don't know.
if you put two header ads or something like that, you know, that's invalid. But I don't know. I can't remember what things we have to describe that at the moment. So it could be that this is worth us being taking a step back and doing something a little bit more clear in the longer term about what we do about partially valid rules. I mean, we've got a couple of tests for partial validity at the moment. Like right now, we've got a test for what happens when you have two rules. One of them is that have cross namespace references, and one of them has a reference grant, and one of them doesn't. And so that's like partially invalid because of the reference grant. But there's probably a bunch of other cases that we need to have partially valid tests for. And then this would be, if we go through and enumerate the ways in which a rule can be invalid, but that if there are other rules that doesn't make the route invalid, then that would be a good thing for us to spend a little bit of time on status for. But that's kind of additive status, if you know what I mean. Like right now, it's just not clearly defined, rather than rather than this is just something we've missed rather than something that we need to fix, if you said on. Like it's not that we need to change what we have already so much as we need to clarify and add extra behavior. So it probably, in my mind, yeah. So Micaiah says that incompatible filters feels a lot like the listener's conflicted condition type. Yeah, and that's exactly what it's intended to be like. It's like something is wrong. So here's some more information about what's wrong. Like the it didn't. It's still attached, but there's something wrong, and so you need to know about that. Is the sort of the use case we're trying to go for here. But it probably does, like, in order to stem the tide of the problem that Rob is talking about, we don't want to end up with 20 possible error conditions that you might want to have to watch, right? Like, it's nice to have something slightly more specific, but it's also bad to have too many hyper-specific error conditions.
Yeah, I'd love to get to a state where we have a single condition that can be used on all route types that is, partially valid or partially, whatever that partial validity condition. And then each route type can have different reasons for that. That seems like a good goal, but I think I agree with what everyone's saying here. This is a nice to have, but not a firm requirement for 060.
I think it's better to push it to 070. Yeah.
Okay.
Sanjay, you said that first, but just to check, that's okay with you?
Yeah, and in terms of conformance and conformant environments, that whole discussion, this would have to you'd have to not be running the webhook, the validating webhook, to specifically hit the case where rewrite and redirect are allowed.
Oh, yeah, very true.
So this is kind of like a weird edge case anyway. So,
yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes. So this also comes under the discussion of, how do we handle, like, when you're not running the webhook, and what do you do and stuff like that. So yeah, this one, definitely is good to push back then.
Cool.
Because there's a whole thing there as well.
I think that means we're going to consider our milestone complete. We can work on actually finalizing that later today, but it sounds like we're good then with this. I appreciate the effort here. It actually, seeing this spelled out helped clarify where our gaps are. And I think we can just build on this to, decide what that new partial validity condition actually looks like, but it's probably not too far off from this. Cool.
Yeah, Dave added a thing about cluster local.
Great. Dave, are you on the call?
Yeah, can you see me now? It's my audio.
Yep.
Yeah, this is just like you'll see me around here presenting key native use cases and raising them often. So like with the backend capabilities kind of getting revisited, I need to do some due diligence myself to see what's landing versus what we need for key native. So I'll revisit that. But this is the other use case that's pretty important. Like you have kind of like a cluster only services that aren't accessible externally in the cluster, but we also do need the L7 load balancing capabilities there, the traffic splitting, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just kind of curious about people's thoughts and how best to move sort of this forward. Like, does it need how do you pronounce this? A GEP? You call it GEP or Jeep?
Gap, okay.
Yeah.
Like, is there anyone interested in sponsoring? Do you need me to sponsor, even though I don't know anything about implementing APIs? Like, I could do a bad GEP, and then that could be a starting point. Like, I don't know. Just curious. I guess this might be more of a meta question. Is like, as things are discussions, what promotes them to sort of the next stage, and then what promotes them further?
It's all a bit woolly at the moment, to be honest. We don't have a formal process around this stuff yet, but I think the request you've got is actually pretty reasonable ask for like a change. Like it's pretty tightly scoped. Like it's like, hey, we want to be able to do this. It feels to me like usually the process for a GEP is that we sort of start talking about, hey, maybe this needs a GEP, and then someone who is sort of wanting to push it starts usually a Google Doc that we use for like that you sort of fill out from a GEP template and start like filling in some of the sections that we talk about it on there, so we can do this async. And we talk about it in a couple of meetings, and then eventually that gets turned into like the actual GEP PR. I think in terms of this specific one, like I said in the issue, it seems relatively reasonable to me that we make the address field like a domain prefix string, so that people can add. You could add like knative.io / cluster or something like that, and then that everyone else would know, hey, I just ignore this because it's domain prefix string, and then that would let you prototype like how the thing would work, and then once you've sort of got a way, once you've got a way to sort of say, hey, this is how we've done it, this is what it looks like. I propose we do something like this, where we take something like this into extended conformance. That cuts a whole bunch of like bike shedding time on, but what about this? But what about this? Like if you've got an implementation and you're like, we've made an implementation, here's how it works, here's what happens. And then it's a much more concrete discussion than if you don't want to end up getting bogged down in your GEP about like, but what do words mean? Which has happened to us quite a lot. Like, but what does it mean for a gateway to be cluster local, right? Like and what you're doing by that is saying, in our implementation, it means this, and here's how the implementation works. Can we take what we've got here and make it extended, and then we can have something more concrete to discuss. We definitely have like backend capabilities is a good example of this, where where like I and a few of us had talked about this, and then when Candace went to implement it, like it seemed reasonable to me, but then there were a whole bunch of other people who it crossed over into their streams and had sort of unanticipated side effects. And so like doing something that's pretty tightly scoped here seems good. I'm not 100% sure what the validation is on that field at the moment. If it doesn't allow a domain prefix string, then there is an API change to say, hey, if you allow a domain prefix string, then we can go away and try this out and see how it goes. And that is a much smaller change that I think is deliverable pretty quickly. Not in the 060 timeframe, but in the 070 timeframe for sure. That sort of feels like an easy place to start that would then help build a GEP. But we can also just go with the full GEP thing and the full court press for the GEP and talk about it in a document and stuff as well, if that's what you prefer to do. Rob?
Yeah, I'd agree with the direction you're heading here of, that for gateway addresses, they're present in spec and status. In spec, you could just specify, I want an address of this type without actually saying the value you want, just I want any address that is of this type. And if that type were some kind of domain prefix cluster IP that was broadly understood, I'm 99% sure our validation right now allows one of the two allow listed, values that aren't domain prefixed, or a domain prefixed value. So I think this should be possible in the API today. If it's not, it's intended to be, but I'm 99% sure it already is. Please definitely let us know if not. I think that's probably the best way to test this out, is to try it with that kind of API and see if that makes sense to you. I was about to go down a rabbit hole, and I think I still will go down that rabbit hole, but I'll stop here and see if that approach makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I guess for some backstory, I work at VMware. So if Sanjay wasn't here and I didn't actually contribute to I actually don't contribute to Contour. I work on I'm an end user, right? Not a Ingress implementer. Would I approach it the same way? Or do you see what I'm saying? The GEP makes sense. What you're suggesting makes sense if I actually implement the solution.
Right, that's what you're saying. Yeah. But you're an end user requesting a feature rather than an implementer saying, I will implement this as a test.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Do you still feel like that approach, like Sanjay might be able to help? I could probably hack together some things in Contour as I don't know. It's just my thing. I'm maybe overestimating my own capabilities here, but curious on thoughts there.
Yeah, I think in the case where you are an end user wanting to request a feature like this, then I think that we need to talk about what we're trying to do and what implementations we'll actually be able to do. And of course, the other thing that we'll need to talk about when you're doing that sort of design without an implementation already, then you need to figure out, what are we trying to do? What can implementations actually do? And then what happens when they can't? What happens when an implementation can't do a cluster IP gateway because you're not, for some reason you can't create a service with a cluster IP or whatever. Unlikely, but possible. And so you need to have the status loop closed there to be like, what happens when you get a type that you can't handle? I mean, that having anything other than those two types kind of requires us to close that status loop anyway. And so, I don't think it's a big deal to do that. But yeah, I think it's a really good point. We haven't had a lot of sort of end user feature requests as yet. And so that's why we're like, I don't know what to do here. And so I think it's a really good point that we need to get better at, that we need to sort of get better at being like, people like, I need to be able to do this and have it work in this way. And then have a way that we can figure out how to actually make that happen in the spec such that implementations can actually do it. I think without having an implementation as a sponsor, to use the words that you were talking about before, the best thing to do is to just make a document talking about what you want and what you want the behavior to be. And that sort of then forms the kernel around which we build a GEP. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure who's. Oh,
was that
okay.
Your audio went a bit weird.
I don't know what you were trying to say, but we lost you into a robot-y something. But maybe drop in chat. I'm not sure. Let me just take this quick opportunity here to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole that came out of the start of our review yesterday that seems very, very similar to this concept. And it was actually initially what I thought was being requested. In my mind, for a long time, an end goal of Gateway API has been to become the next service front end. So that's, many people have thought, okay, Gateway API is the next generation of Ingress. It can be the next generation of service type load balancer. But what about service type cluster IP? Could it be that service front end? We've been having all these discussions in Gamma about how a service is really two things, right? It's a front end and it's a grouping for a bunch of backends. And that makes our Gamma UX a little funny, and that you're attaching to a service front end and then forwarding to a bunch of backends, but also service. So it's like, it feels kind of funny. A big bit of feedback is, can we separate that out? So one of the things that came up in that was really this section here. Could we abstract all of this away and split service out into new types? So you had a type that allocated cluster IPs and DNS names. Maybe that's two different types. I don't know. And service would automatically create those. When you create a service, it maps to those things. But it would also be a way for any other API, such as Gateway API, to allocate a cluster IP or DNS name for a gateway, and have it be respected across everything. This is like a high level idea that came out of the Gamma discussion about, what exactly are we doing when we're attaching, parent ref above as service and then backend ref below is also service. That feels confusing. Is this a path that we could use to do gateway of cluster IP, gateway class cluster IP that is truly generic and supported, directly by Kubernetes without any additional implementation? Don't know, but just I thought I would bring that up. It's in the notes here, but just if anyone sees that and says, yes, this is definitely what I want, I'd love to get that discussion going more broadly. These are kind of longer, these take, cycles to get through. These are enhancement cycles. This takes time to get through, but I think it's a really interesting vision and I'd love to see it happen, but it would, be easier to make happen if we had a broad set of people that actually wanted this and had use cases for it. So it sounds like this thing would solve your specific request, but it's definitely a much longer term thing than I think you want to sign up for. Unfortunately, I am still getting some weird robot-y noise from you. Sorry.
Yeah, how about now?
Oh, perfect. We can hear you.
Switch my mic. I guess you're saying that this cluster IP would be like a core gauge type and it needs to go through the whole KEP process and things like that.
Yeah. That one will take a while because that's sort of like, that feels like it's analogous to like the endpoint to endpoint slice transition in terms of like figuring out an API and making it so that the API server does it all for you and handles the mechanics and, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it would be really nice if we could do it because then you end up with something like endpoint slice that is the right way to do this. But there are other, but API server will sort of magic some things for you so that you don't have to worry about the details.
I guess this sort of feels like how you would implement it versus what you presented to me as an end user of programming.
I think I mostly agree with you. I just want to say there is one bit of difference here. The way that we were talking about first of like you just put an address type that you want in gateway spec is something that would rely on an individual implementation to do a thing, right? So it would be I need to make a feature request to Contour or whoever it is, right? Whereas this much longer path is something that would work in any Kubernetes cluster is the vision for it, right? It's something that is built into Kubernetes. So then that is just a portable generic way to do a thing.
Hey Rob, this is John. How would that map to routes? So if I did a cluster service under the covers, would it map to individual route types or?
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, right now you can do like a cluster IP service and have multiple ports in that cluster IP service that forward TCP traffic or UDP traffic, right? Like, and you specify that inside the service spec. I mean, as we've done in the rest of this, we're kind of trying to break apart that, enormous chunk of config that is the service spec and split it up into separate things. And so there'd be, what you're talking about here is you would have a gateway of cluster IP with a cluster IP instead of with an externally visible IP, and that you could then attach TCP routes, UDP routes, or HTTP routes or HTTPS routes to, and have it be like, have it work kind of like a, doing it that way and doing it with cluster IP basically gets you the mesh functionality like Gamma wants, for HTTP route and TLS route and stuff like that. And then it also gives you sort of a more east-westy kind of way to handle TCP and UDP. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Think about it some more.
Yeah. Like, I think it definitely. Like, I know why you're asking for it, Dave, because Knative has a very specific use case where you want cluster IP and you want to be able to hairpin things and stuff like that. And so yeah, I get what you're asking for it, but the kind of the reason that it's a bit hairy is because this is another case like backend capabilities where if you just add in type of cluster IP, then that makes that gateway effectively like Rob was talking about, like it's like a sort of pseudo mesh thing where it's like replacement for service of type cluster IP, which has strong implications for how the rest of the API is used. It's one of those classic cases of a very small change that has like massive butterfly effect style implications on the rest of the API. And that sucks because like the ask that you're asking for as a user is straightforward and relatively easy, but because it has these big implications for how the rest of the API works, like I can't just be like, yeah, sure, we'll just go do that, which sucks.
Yeah, a good discussion all around. I think there's a lot more to go on both directions here. If there's an implementation out there that wants to try out this kind of, just look at spec address, just type, I would love to see if that works in practice, because that's going to be a much faster thing to support. But certainly also interested if there's broader interest in that longer term vision for Kubernetes cluster IP gateways. I would love to make that work, but again, we're talking a while for that to happen, like certainly greater than 1 year away. Yeah. Okay. That's, I think, everything on the agenda. Any last bits? Cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for a good discussion. Hope everyone has a good Thanksgiving for those that celebrate, and we will talk to everyone next week. Have a great one.